Started. Good afternoon and welcome everybody who's here. I'm Callan Steinman. I'm Curator of Education here at the Georgia Museum of Art. I'm delighted to welcome you to today's program, a Curator Talk on the exhibition Rediscovering the Art of Victoria Hutson Huntley, which is on view for just a short time longer here at the Georgia Museum of Art through August 15th. And I'm excited to introduce our speakers for today, our presenters. Our first speaker is co-curator of this exhibition, Dr. Lynn Barstis Katz. She is librarian emerita for art and special collections at Auburn University. She holds a PhD from the University of Illinois and an MLS from SUNY Albany. She is the scholar of images of the South in art prints and Alabama art colonies, and she's the compiler of American printmakers from 1880 to 1945, an index to reproductions and biocritical information, and the author of Imprinting the South, Southern printmakers and their images of the region from the 1920s to 1940s. We are also joined by Dr. Stephen Goldfarb, who is an independent scholar and co-curator of this exhibition as well. Stephen holds a BA and MA in history from the University of Texas at Austin, and a PhD in the history of science and technology from Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland. As an independent scholar, Stephen has published articles on Leo Frank, Southern history, history of science, and more recently curated exhibits of 1920 to 1960 American printmakers for the Georgia Museum of Art and the Mobile Museum of Art, and contributed to an exhibit for the Tatum Gallery in South Africa. Thank you so much for being here, and without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Lynn Barstis Katz.
I want to thank Kaylin, first of all, for hosting this meeting, and I want to thank staff at the Georgia Museum of Art who were responsible and assisted in putting this exhibit online. It was really nice to be able to inform friends and family of it, but also I'm on Facebook. I hardly ever post anything other than birthday greetings when I'm notified of someone's birthday, or congratulations, condolences for an event. But I did post this exhibit and the links to it and Facebook, and found a number of people viewed it that way as well. So it's great. You might notice the sort of strange subtitle that I have here. It's geographical, and that's to emphasize the organization of the exhibit, which follows kind of the geography of Victoria Hutson Huntley's life, where she lived. Started off in the New York area, we will define as the first segment of her printmaking oeuvre, her work in total. Moved to Florida from 1946 to 1953, and then back north to 2 spots. And this is kind of important because she was a realistic artist, an artist devoted to realism. I won't say she depicted exactly what she saw, but it was the starting point, at least for many of her compositions, as to what she depicted in realistic form. Okay, next. First of all, it's important to note that she was a painter, like so many artists. She came to printmaking after painting. She grew up in the New York City area, born in New Jersey, but as a baby, they moved her and her family to New York, and was able to take advantage of the educational opportunities in art available there, specifically at the Art Students League, where I think from the age of 12 on, she studied art Saturdays. And then instead of going to college, she spent 3 years of their training. And so she came to printmaking in the 1930, and by that time she was well established as a, I don't know, say draftsman, draftsperson, skilled in drawing and painting. And we have 2 in the exhibit, one in oil, one in pastel, to emphasize that painting was part of her work. And she also said that painting was the initial stage for her printmaking process. She started out recording her impressions in painting, and then went to drawing, and then the final stage in lithography. I think the first painting here in oil is an early work because of the emphasis on detail, which we see more in her early works, first stage of her work in prints even, and then the pastel with its simplification of form, probably from the latter part. Next. Okay, making a lithograph. Well, you see her, looks like rubbing a sponge over a stone, sheet of Bavarian limestone. That's the traditional medium for the plate of a lithograph. Many people explain it simply as drawing with a waxy crayon on that stone and running water over the stone, and then ink is attracted to the image that's drawn and it's rejected by the water. But it's a little more complicated than that because there is a stage that they refer to as the etch because it's with acid. And it's a solution of gum arabic and nitric acid that they put on to make sure the image adheres to the stone. And it's a tricky process. And an artist told me, if you don't do it right, you can lose the image. So traditionally, artists have turned to experts in printing to help them in printing their lithographs. And this was the situation with Huntley. A well-known New York art dealer, Carl Ziegrosser, who abetted many artists in his gallery, suggested that she see this printer named George Miller. And he was the one who helped her in printing her first lithographs all the way up till about the late 40s, 1948, when she had a grant and she was able to afford her own press and the supplies that went with it. Okay, next. This is her second lithograph that she did. She started lithography in 1930. That means that she was 30 years old. So, you know, she was an accomplished artist by then. It's a still life we see with two challenging subjects, a spinning wheel and a 19th century Windsor chair, standing out nicely against this light background where she's filled in all the image area. She says this is derived from her dining room in a farmhouse in Caldwell, New Jersey. At a certain point, she and her first husband moved to Caldwell, New Jersey, still within the New York area. And so she apparently had some antique objects there, which would be challenging to her drawing skills. And we see, as I said, how she's filled in the background with the painting in the background, a rug and a column and so forth. Now this print, second only that she did, won a prize, first prize in lithography at the Chicago Art Institute exhibit in 1930. So I'm going to think you're going to see that she tended to look for challenging subjects here for lithography. She found it very easy, she said, to draw on the lithographic stone. Next. And another challenging composition. I think it's from the same house because the same panel door, but here she's to the left of the doorway. The viewpoint, at least, is to the left of the doorway, looking into this hall and a stairwell on which a child climbs. And this probably is her daughter. She was married in 1924 and her daughter was born in 1925. So this, I think the title a little bit is obscured here. It's 1931. Her daughter would have been 6 years old. And this struck me as not only interesting as a composition, but an apt symbol for a child's progress through life, moving up a stairway. Next. Okay, a simpler image in a cabin, but look what she's done. She's formed the image area into a circular form, circular structure. And interesting what she's done with these trees that you see kind of would actually connect, even though they don't actually connect, but artistically, we can see a line implied from the one in the lower right to the left. They point to the house. So see, she's done something innovative with this. And I want to say here that her works, her prints are generally not titled. They are signed and usually have a date. We know of titles that have become associated with them from her archives. And Stephen and I were very lucky in being able to access her archives at the Smithsonian Archives of American Art digitally. They scanned them and sent them to Stephen. He sent them to me. And so we know of titles from exhibition records and lists that she had, that she drew up. Also, somebody who's very particular and looking at details might notice differences in the signatures of her early prints. She was divorced in 1933 and remarried in 1934. So from 1930 to 1934, her signatures don't have Huntley on them. They may be Victoria Abels Huntley, her maiden name, I'm sorry, Victoria Abels Hutson, or just Victoria Hudson. I think you're going to see that these way she works with these tree branches works as a kind of framing device for the image we'll see in other images and other prints. Next. Okay, this is, she said, one of her best early prints. There were two. One of which I will mention later is not in the show, but it is in the catalog, an industrial scene. And this was one of New York and was actually a view from the 26th floor of a friend's office building. So that's why the tops have been cut off of these imposing buildings. They look like skyscrapers and we don't see the bottom. Very rectangular, angular block-like forms, contrasting with this house or building to the lower right that looks like it's a more ornate mansard roof there for contrast, and then the Statue of Liberty in the back. And in my essay, I said I kind of saw a connection there, causal connection between the Statue of Liberty as suggesting freedom, and she did says in her writing that she did deliberately put that in for that purpose, but suggesting maybe prosperity, suggests the buildings due to the freedom we have symbolized by the Statue of Liberty. But of course, this would have been the Depression era, the nadir of the Great Depression. It doesn't seem to have influenced her from her writing in any way. That one of her best compositions, I think. Next. Okay, we move on to figurative works with human figures. And I think one of the interests of this early period that goes from 1930 to 1946 is the variety of iconography, that's to say imagery, that we do have in the prints. And here it's a group scene with a number of figures of young people, and they're all looking to the lower left to this pair that are ice skating in tandem. And we don't know the details of this, the story behind this. She doesn't mention this in her writing. This may be friends just expressing their friendship, or an older young person helping the younger learn to skate, something like this, but it leaves it up to the viewer what the situation is. But it shows her skill in another kind of composition with a lot of human figures interacting together, unified by this glance that they all direct to the one in the left. And in the background, we see another figure group, more complexity here, where it looks like a skater putting on his skates. And then she fills in the background scene, a snow skiing. Next. Okay, Babe in Arms. This is based on a painting I found out from a magazine article on her, probably influenced by her motherhood, the fact that she had this daughter, child sleeping in the mother's arms, looking or at least a young woman's arms looking on tenderly. arms wrapped around the child, the arm, right arm of the adult figure connecting to the child's leg. The child has his hand on her breast. Very tender scene. Notice the modeling of the figures, how round they seem through her modeling with shading there. And in the background, we don't know what the setting is. She leaves the background indeterminate, which is often the case in her prints. She doesn't always fill in that background and indicate a specific setting. Next. And another one where we don't have much of a setting implied, just a swath of gray there on which the old fiddler sits with his fiddle pointed down at a couple in the background, which are the contents of his mind, his memory, his dreams. We don't know, something similar to that, probably influenced by her making of a mural for the WPA, the Treasury Department Post Office mural, Fiddler's Green, or I think Springville or Springdale, New York, something like that in the late 30s. It may have been influenced by that. Next. And another figure group of 3 figures. I kind of think this was maybe an exercise in drawing the human figure in different postures, but it could have been influenced by maybe her daughter and her friends. We have one young girl looking out at us at the view as a viewer, and a boy next to her drawing, and another young fellow looking out at a mountain scene, mountain landscape in the background. Maybe shows, said, possibly adolescent tendency to be self-absorbed. We don't know. She didn't write about this print. Next. And then botanicals. She did a number of them in her, we say, oeuvre, her total work. And as I said, she'd drawn to sort of complex subjects that showed her drawing skill. And here is the petunia with its crinkled edge. Notice how she highlights it by this area of gray that's behind it. Otherwise, we don't know what the setting is. It's just the floral, the flowers, and a butterfly with the pattern of its wings is very well drawn and clearly visible in this black and white print of 1935. Next. And another more exotic plant, Indian pipes. These are white that she puts against the background, and they're white because they don't have any chlorophyll. And they're parasitic plants that rely on the decaying matter of other vegetable forms. So we see this in the dead leaves in the lower area. But again, a dark background to highlight these plants. Next. Okay, we move to landscapes, and here's where she's working with light, and she does this quite a bit in her prints in black and white. Here it's moonlight on the mountain, 2 tree forms, fir tree, I think, on one, I'm not sure what the other one is to the right, and then light coming through, it looks like dark clouds. And here, I think there's sort of inspiration or incentive to suggest some kind of symbolic interpretation, like goodness coming through bad, or insight coming through ignorance, or something like that. Light is an archetypal symbol that can say so many positive qualities. Next. And then dawn came, again, so easily suggestive of a symbolic interpretation of a new day, bad experiences, and something like that. We have a rural landscape in the lower portion of the image area, and then this burst of light in the background. Next. And then White World. This is a snow scene. And again, I notice what I'd like you to notice the tree limbs connecting there to kind of frame the image of what might be a farmhouse or a barn in a circular sort of form. And then you've got tracks footprints over to the left, and then a series of horizontal lines suggesting the far distance. She said she loved the cold. She loved the winter scene. So this was not a dreary, lonely scene to her. This would have been something positive. Okay, next. And then we do have one piece here that is in another category of prints called intaglio. It includes engraving, etching, aquatint, mezzotint, dry point, where the image is incised in some way on a metal plate. So there's a depression which is filled with ink, and it's pressed against paper to create the print. And engraving, this is done very directly with a tool called a burin. And she took to engraving over etching, which is kind of unusual for artists at this time, because etching, where it's done through wax and you dip it in a whole plate, and after it's the image is drawn through wax, it's dipped in acid, which eats into the metal plate, and it's easier to draw through, but engraving's a little more difficult. We do have this one piece in the show to show that she did experiment with another print medium, and a very delicate, just the calf's head, very, very delicate and sweet though. Okay, next. And then a more complex image, we go back to architecture, 1946, the year that she left the New York area. This is an 1830s bridge in Vermont, she says, near Woodstock. And the sides of it are what we would describe, I think, as a truss, where you have these beams, X-beams, holding up the roof, and arches as well. And she was intrigued, it looks like, with this complicated structure and the shadows that it projected. And we'll see another print where she's concerned with including shadows in the image area to create a really complex composition, but very, very realistic and very detailed. Okay, we'll go on to the next one, I think. 1946, she and her husband, and maybe her daughter, I'm not sure, moved to Florida. He took a job at Rollins College near Orlando. They lived in Winter Park. She was not really happy with the Florida climate. As I said, she was a cold weather person. And as you can imagine, it would have been pretty hot in days before air conditioning. But she envisioned a new project, which is depicting the flora and fauna of Florida, and particularly the Everglades. In 1947, she received a grant from the National Institute of Arts and Letters, and in 1948, from the Guggenheim Museum. I said previously that she bought her printmaking equipment with that money. And she set out on this project to depict especially the birds of the Everglades. The Everglades is there in the tip of the Florida Peninsula. We have an essay in the bulletin. Artist explores the Everglades, so she writes about her experiences exploring one portion of the Everglades. Here's a typical scene that she did where we see a low horizon line. We see what is the typical vegetation of a good part of the Everglades, sawgrass. It's called sawgrass because one side of the blade is like a saw, really sharp. There's water there and these little hillocks in the background, little islands, maybe slightly hills with some tree forms. But of course the birds, the egrets and the herons, and then against this sky. Okay, we'll go on. She said she became birdie, I think she said, and she joined the Audubon Society and became really interested. She had a new interest from this new environment. She went to, on her little excursion that she writes about, Cuthbert Rookery in the Everglades. Now this is, she said, like a semicircle, a mound, which is a nesting place for birds. And we see a lot of egrets in the lower portion and others flying above. It's named Cuthbert because it's after one of the most infamous poachers of birds in the Everglades, and there were many of them. Cuthbert was only one that would shoot these birds and shoot them for their feathers that were used for women's hats. And it was quite the rage at the end of the 19th century for women to wear these hats with feathers. So this was a big project of the budding environmentalist movement in Florida to stop this egregious decimation of the bird population. She doesn't mention any of this in her essay. She comes to this whole experience of investigating the flora and fauna of the Everglades as a newcomer and outsider. So she's not really aware of the background there in trying to do something about the Everglades. They tried to reconstitute it as agricultural land at one point and so forth, and then stop these poachers. But she just wants to show the bird forms. And also here we have the mangrove plant. I don't know, I looked it up on the internet, and it's defined as a tree and as a shrub, but these see more of this growth that is typical of the tip of the Florida Peninsula Everglades area in these kind of stick-like forms jutting up into clouds, and a nice cloud there in the sky. Next. And then we have some of the birds close up. As I said, Cuthbert Rookery was a nesting place for birds. So you see a nest in the background, and those have been identified as probably ibis. They look like egrets, but actually I am not an expert in Florida birds. So what I have done is sent images of these prints to the Florida Natural History Museum at the University of Florida, and a very nice man there, Mr. Tom Weber, responded to me, and he said, well, actually, this is the white form of the heron. And I thought egrets were white and herons were dark, but to me, they look like egrets. At any rate, they stand out against the dark background, left kind of indeterminate. And notice the mangrove, again, this framing of the image with these tree limbs that could just kind of circle around the birds as if to protect them. Next. And then another open landscape. She describes these scenes as open, very open, the birds flying over the sawgrass, and water in the background, and a hillock in the background too. Next. Not an open landscape. Here's where you do have tree forms with this hanging moss that always looks so, as if it makes the scene so romantic, hanging down in points and kind of drips, and then these birds flying overhead. A very lovely scene. So it wasn't all treeless. Next. And then a vertical scene, Ocklawaha River, #1. That is a river in Central Florida that is a small river that flows into the St. Johns, which if you look at the map of Florida, just wanders, wow. From
I lost it just for a minute, but it's bad.
Okay. Very strong verticals here. These look like cypress trees and an egret, and I will refer to my notes that Mr. Weber told me those on the bird on the bottom might be a purple gallinule, but it's a very dramatic scene with this egret form, wading bird form, white against these strong verticals of hanging moss in these trees. Next. There weren't all bird scenes. We have one that's a landscape of a storm coming in. And the storm is designated by these very strong diagonal lines from the upper left to the lower right. with dark clouds, light coming in through them. She said this, and she's in her writing, she wrote about this and said it was a hurricane coming in on the St. Johns River. And she said she loved storms. She just thought they, you know, inspired her creativity. And that just kind of blows my mind because I just freak out over dangerous hurricanes and tornadoes, anything very bad weather. But small human figures for scale there. It looks like they're palm trees jutting up. First time I've seen palm trees in her work. Next. And then another bird scene. I'm going to refer to my notes here from my bird collection manager friend at the Florida Natural History Museum. Gulls in the center there. The left is a black skimmer, and the 5 around the water's edge, sandpiper. So different forms of birds. Maybe this is it. She doesn't write about this. We don't know exactly where this is, but again, an interesting sky also to complement the aviary scene. Next. Okay, one unique bird that she highlights, and we do have good images of in prints, is the Roseata. I don't know if I'm pronouncing this right. Roseate Spoonbill.
Roseate.
Roseate?
Yep. Roseate Spoonbill.
Roseate Spoonbill. And here you see it. It's got this long beak. It's wider at the tip than in the middle, and a big wingspan. We see 2 here, but one is in the lower portion looking for food, it seems. So we see a good image of that here against the mangrove limbs in the lower portion. And then next, we're going to see this in color. Now, I really wondered why she would hide this bird behind these mangrove limbs. At least we see the color of the wings, that they are kind of a rosy pink color, and we see the form of the bill. Maybe she was showing the mangrove structure protecting the bird. I don't know, but it is in color. I'm glad we have one print in color because she did turn to color lithography, like so many artists at the time. When you do a color print, traditionally what you do have is a different plate for each color. And if you had to have a different stone for each, this could really be laborious, one on top of the other. A staff member at the museum here, the Jewel Collins Smith, has a major in lithography. And she said what they did is they would have the main color on the stone, and then they would have other colors that you do have to register with the design on the keystone, so it lines up in a metal plate. Metal plates were used for lithography, so that would be easier to register one on top of the other. And here it looks like blue with pink and brown. So good example of where she turned in her later work. Next. Okay, she did do some other animal forms besides birds. Here, we have 2 of Florida deer. Now here the challenge would be you have dark creatures, most of them brown, against a dark landscape. And she depicted these in the Ocala Forest Reserve, she says. She studied deers in a zoo, in Sanford Zoo near Orlando. So what she does is the deer are a slightly shade lighter in dark gray against this dark background in the one on the upper right. And then to the right, we see they're almost the same value. I say value and talk about light and dark, not in terms of money or anything, but she does make them stand out because of the circular forms of the deer resting against the verticals of these trees. And next, okay, a raccoon. We think it's titled The Enemy. from archival lists, the enemy, because it would have been a predator of the wading birds and eating their eggs. And here it's charging forward. And we have here mangrove limbs that, again, their leaves, it looks like, are kind of framing this image of the raccoon, which is always interesting, I think, because of its face. Next. She did take a trip to Charleston to study with a bird expert there, and she couldn't resist doing some prints of beautiful Charleston. And here it's one of a gate, and of course that would have been challenging to her, and a cast iron gate with its intricate pattern, and then linked to a fence, and then it projects its shadows on the sidewalk. Behind it, this is a complex scene where the background is really filled in, where you have a garden behind that with a statue and trees, and then behind that, looks like a 19th century house with a porch, and then behind that, a simple building, looks like a modern utilitarian building. I did contact the South Carolina Historical Society to see if this place could be identified. And the person responded that said it could loosely be interpreted as a view of the County Records Building from Meeting Street, which is the main thoroughfare through Charleston. Next. And then what I think is one of her most symbolic scenes, where you have, she says, this flower woman, little woman sitting at the base of the stairway of which is South Carolina Society Hall. And here you have these white pillars, and they've just got to be interpreted as like the pillars of white society. And you recognize that this woman could not enter the entrance, the front door of that building at the time because of racial exclusion. So to me, it's always been a highly symbolic print of the whole racial situation at the time. She was not an artist, I would say, who was really socially conscious, but you have here and there little suggestions of a social situation. Next. Okay, in 1953, she and her husband left Florida because she had developed this ailment from, I guess, the climate, amoebic dysentery, and very sick with it. And doctors in New York advised them to leave the Florida area, that the climate was not being beneficial to her. So he took a job in Chicago, and they were there until, I think, from
1954, I think, in 1965,
and when they went to Geneva, Illinois, which is right on the outskirts. So what she became enthralled with at this time is another sort of exciting image, iconography in her surroundings in South Chicago, which is the steel mills. And she did an industrial print in her early years in the 1930s, for which she won a prize and said was one of her best prints. It's called Copper's Coke. We do not have that in the show, the exhibit, but it is in the bulletin because she said it was one of her best and she won a prize for it. But there are a number of them of the Chicago steel mills. Unfortunately, we have a very strong image here in the steel mill. We see furnaces, I think, to either side of this strong pole in the center with this white cloud of gas, steam, whatever, coming out in the background. Against, again, this dark background, which is kind of indeterminate. So a very strong image. And Stephen might want to say more about this later on, because he has been in the Society of Industrial Archaeology and would know more about this than me. But in other words, I'll go on. This is her later stage now of her work. And let's go on to the next one. Another one of animals, horses prancing. Much more, I would say, fluid, loose handling of the figures of these horses than the earlier prints that we've seen. A loose brush stroke. I say brush stroke, she may have used the liquid form of the crayons called touche, which you can apply. You don't have to have the hard crayon for lithography. It looks to me like big brush strokes in the background. The background is left indeterminate. It looks like kind of a dreamlike scene. But horses were one of her favorite subjects. Move on to 1963. This is actually the year when they moved again to a northern locale, to Chatham Township, New Jersey. And go on to the next one. Ancient Place in 1964. You see here, there's simplification of form. She's no longer interested in highly detailed works. She's slowing down, I think, at this point. She's had not maybe continuing problems with this amoebic dysentery. I'm not sure Stephen can come on that later, but she had osteoarthritis of the back too, I believe, probably from lifting those heavy stones. So her work, the images tend to be more simplified here, and a lot of rectangles in this architectural view. Next. And then this is apparently part of a monument. I do not know what this is. I think what she has done is taken a section of some structure and magnified it to create a more abstract composition. And this is the time of American art history when abstraction has come in. And she would have been influenced by this to some degree, it seems. But it does communicate certain qualities like strength, support, and so forth. And we'll go on. And then one that she did of the Everglades birds from memory called Andante, which refers to tempo in musical compositions, a slow movement. And you see these two egret forms in parallel formation, no competition from clouds in the sky against the sky there in the sawgrass in the lower portion. Very simple composition, but very beautiful. And she was, you know, not sympathetic, but can't think of the right word, but she did feel, she was nostalgic, I think, to some degree, for, even though it caused her some discomfort, her experiences in Florida with these birds. Next. And finally, the last print in our series is a doorway, a simple doorway with a frame that's in the Doric style of columns. You have 3 styles in Greek columns, and the Doric is the simplest one that we see at the top portion of this doorway. And I think it's good we have this print for the end of the series, indicating the end of her life, because this is the year she died. Next print, 1971, July 3rd, 1971. So she lived 71 years. And that's all I have. I'd like to turn it over to Stephen. And first of all, thank him, because he was the inspiration for this exhibit. It was his idea. He presented it to the exhibition committee at the Georgia Museum. He supplied most of the art, most of the prints and the 2 paintings for the exhibit. And if you've seen the bulletin, did a great deal of work editing her writings, Huntley's writings, and the biographical information that we have of her autobiography that we were able to publish, and then individual essays on her. So Stephen, it's your turn now.
Okay. Callan, am I on?
Yes.
Okay. I'd like, I have just a few brief things to say, but I do want to quote Bill Island in his sort of introduction or to the catalog, and the catalog is available. But Bill, I think, summed up her life rather interestingly. He writes, "I was not prepared, nor my staff, for what our writers would uncover and present. The heretofore unpublished autobiography is a powerful document recounting years of struggle and success, of ambition and perseverance. For anyone interested in the history of American art in the 20th century, Huntley's description of her travails as well as her triumphs is intrinsically important. Well, in the catalog, I wrote a 4 or 5 page essay on her health. And she enjoyed pretty good health until about her 50th year. And Lynn has already mentioned the amoebic dysentery, but in 1950, one of the sources we have is a fairly extensive correspondence with Carl Ziegrosser, and she mentions not feeling well. A couple of years later, she went to New York. She could not get, and amazes me, that in Florida, she could not get the doctors to ultimately diagnose her with amoebic dysentery. And she was in the hospitals a number of weeks. She was in New York for 5 weeks, but this was at the very end of their stay it was 1952 in Florida. They moved to the Chicago area. She had another milder attack in 1957, but she had to regularly go back and get samples and this and that and the other, but apparently she was able to get out from under it. However, in her 60s, she suffered from osteoarthritis, which curtailed her using the lithograph press. I should point out here that those lithograph stones weigh up to 70 pounds. And in fact, her husband helped her build a device so she wouldn't have to lift them. She could move them laterally across from her press to her press. In any event, she had this osteoarthritis, painful, and it really slowed her down a great deal. She had a surgery in August of 1966. Progress was slow. She was able to drive by 1967, seems to have enjoyed some good health for the next 18 months, including a trip to Venezuela to see her daughter. Then disaster struck. Her hips, both of them, as it turned out, took a turn for the worst. She had an early hip replacement in December 1969, and she never seems to have gotten over it. I was in contact with the Emory University Medical Library. I think it's called Health Sciences Library now, but they turned up for me an article entitled "The McKee-Farrar Hip Replacement Failed at a High Rate because the impingement caused component loosening." I think that means the screws loosened. This was a 1999 retrospective. She was one of the very first people. This was the first generation of hip replacements. Anyway, I don't believe she ever got over it. The correspondence with Ziegrosser, I don't think she wanted, when you don't get letters, you sometimes think there's a problem on the other end. And she didn't live much longer than she died in the summer of 1971. The surgery was in December of 69. So it's a sort of sad ending to a very productive artistic career. I'll finally say I have no evidence about the weight of the stone and the shape of her hips, but it just strikes me that picking up 70-pound stones just can't be good for your body. I don't think she was a particularly large human being. So anyway, that's all I have to say. You can, this is fleshed out in my essay in the catalog.
Thank you. Thank you both so much for sharing about her life and her work. It's a beautiful exhibition, and I would urge, again, those of you who are maybe in the Athens area and haven't had a chance to check it out yet, to do so before it closes soon. But there is an online version of the show on our website, and I'll try to pop the link in the chat for those who attended. So it has a few of the works of art that are on view that you can see online too. Jean Petrovs, who's one of our docents here at the museum, has a comment, just that it's a lovely show and she took her friends through it and they had a wonderful time. It is a beautiful exhibition. I agree.
Good. I wish it were closer to me so I could go over and see it.
I know. And I wrote a word of thanks from Rosemary, who says, "Thank you so much for this interesting program. I'm looking forward to seeing the exhibit at the museum." Thank you, Rosemary.
Thank you.
I think one of the first things I noticed when I saw the works is how beautifully she used the paper, the white paper. So it just, everything seems to pop off the walls when you look at the works.
That's interesting. Interesting comment.
Yeah, I agree. I think
Yeah.
I was just going to say, I'm not a printmaker, but I have such kind of respect and admiration for printmakers because it's such a complex process. And there's so many different ways you can experiment and sort of manipulate the outcome that like seeing people like her who are such experts, masters at it is really just, it's incredible.
Yeah. She was an expert by the time she came to it at the age of 30 in 1930, and she continued on. And then there's a little bit of a decline, I think, in their later years. It's understandable. But from 1930 to about 1950, those were her prime years, I think.
Thanks again so much to Lynn and Stephen for being with us today. Thanks so much, everybody, and have a great afternoon.
Bye.
Thank you.